September 19, 1944. A cattle ranch turned prisoner of war camp outside Hereford, Texas. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty compound where 37 German women stood in confused silence, staring at the metal trays before them. On each tray sat something they had never seen before. A round bun split in half, cradling a thick patty of ground beef, topped with sliced tomatoes, lettuce, and a strange orange cheese that glistened in the heat. The aroma was rich, savory, and utterly foreign. Corporal Jack Morrison, a third-generation cattle rancher who'd traded his spurs for a guard's uniform, watched the women's faces with growing concern. He'd been told these prisoners were half-starved, that they'd be grateful for any food. Instead, they looked at the hamburgers with something between suspicion and shock. One woman, a slender blonde named Greta Fisher, poked at the bun with her fork as if it might explode. Another, dark-haired Marguerite Kohler, whispered frantically to her neighbor in German, her eyes wide with disbelief. What could possibly make captured enemy soldiers afraid of a simple hamburger? Before we discover how this meal transformed everything these women believed about America, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier, but this moment in the mess hall would become the turning point that none of them saw coming. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, captured during the Allied advance through France. Young women who had served as communications specialists, administrative clerks, and auxiliary support for the Wehrmacht. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, wasteful, and cruel. They had been warned about American food, strange concoctions designed to poison the German spirit. Now they sat before these hamburgers, their first real meal since arriving at the Texas camp 3 days earlier. The journey across the Atlantic had been long and frightening. The processing center in New York had been cold and bureaucratic, but nothing had prepared them for this. For abundance, for meat that wasn't rationed, for guards who smiled instead of shouted, for food served hot and plentiful on clean trays. Corporal Morrison stepped forward, removing his weathered Stetson hat in a gesture of respect that surprised the women. In broken German, learned hastily from a phrasebook, he spoke, "Bitte essen. Please, eat. Is good. American food." Greta looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his sunburned face for signs of mockery or malice. She found neither. Only a simple cowboy's genuine confusion about why anyone would hesitate to eat a perfectly good hamburger. She picked up the burger with trembling hands, brought it to her lips, and took the smallest bite possible. Her eyes widened, and everything she thought she knew about America began to crumble. The German women had arrived at Camp Hereford 3 days before that fateful hamburger meal, exhausted from a journey that had stripped away every assumption they'd held about their captivity. The train from the East Coast Processing Center had traveled for 2 days across American landscapes that seemed impossibly vast. Greta Fisher had pressed her face against the window, watching forests give way to plains, watching cities dissolve into endless horizons of grass and sky. "It never ends," whispered Marguerite, sitting beside her. "How can one country be so large?" They had been taught that America was crowded, chaotic, its resources depleted by wasteful excess. Instead, they saw space that seemed to stretch forever, farms larger than entire German villages, cattle herds numbering in the thousands. The propaganda had prepared them for deprivation. Reality was offering them something far more unsettling. The camp itself was nothing like they'd imagined. No watchtowers with searchlights, no barbed wire fences stretching toward the sky. Instead, a collection of wooden barracks arranged around a dusty courtyard, bordered by simple wire fencing that seemed almost decorative. Beyond the fence, cattle grazed on rolling pasture land, and in the distance, ranch houses dotted the horizon. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, one of only 2 female officers assigned to the facility, had been waiting when they arrived. She was a tall woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, her uniform crisp despite the Texas heat. She'd addressed them in clear, slow English, and when they didn't understand, she'd simply shown them to their barracks without frustration. The sleeping quarters shocked them almost as much as the landscape. Each woman had her own cot with clean sheets, a footlocker, and a small shelf. Windows opened to let in the evening breeze. The bathroom facilities were basic, but functional, and private. This wasn't captivity, as they'd been trained to expect it. The guards were even more confusing. Instead of hardened soldiers, most were local ranchers and farmhands. Men in their 40s and 50s who'd been pulled from their land to supervise prisoners because the younger men were fighting overseas. They wore uniforms that never quite fit right, and they walked with the bow-legged gait of men who'd spent more time on horseback than in formation. Corporal Morrison had been assigned as their primary day supervisor. He'd introduced himself by tipping his hat, a gesture so quintessentially Western that several women had actually laughed nervously, unsure if he was mocking them. He wasn't. That was simply how a Texas cowboy greeted anyone, enemy or not. Those first 3 days had been a blur of processing, orientation, and overwhelming confusion. The women spoke little English. The guards spoke no German. Communication happened through gestures, demonstration, and patience. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for what would happen in the mess hall on that September afternoon. The first morning after their arrival, the women woke to a sound none of them could identify. A long, mournful call that seemed to roll across the prairie like distant thunder. Greta sat up on her cot, her heart racing. "What is that?" she whispered to Marguerite in the darkness before dawn. "I don't know," Marguerite replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "An air raid siren?" But there was no panic, no running feet, no shouted orders, just that strange, haunting sound, fading into the morning stillness. Later, they would learn it was simply a cattle call, a cowboy signaling to his herd, but in that moment it was one more piece of evidence that they had landed on an alien planet. Everything about Camp Hereford defied their expectations. The guards didn't march, they ambled. They didn't shout commands. They offered suggestions in drawling English the women couldn't parse. When the prisoners lined up for morning count, Corporal Morrison actually apologized for making them stand in formation, explaining through gestures that it was required by regulations, not his personal preference. The women exchanged confused glances. Enemy soldiers didn't apologize to prisoners. Breakfast that first morning had been equally bewildering. Scrambled eggs, toast with butter, coffee with real cream. The portions were generous, the quality better than what many of them had eaten in Germany even before the war. Greta had stared at her plate, afraid to eat, wondering if this abundance was some kind of trick, a test to see if they would show weakness by eating greedily. Marguerite had been the first to try the food, her hunger overcoming her suspicion. She'd taken a small bite of toast, then stopped, her eyes filling with unexpected tears. "It's real," she'd whispered. "It's actual butter." The camp routine was explained through a combination of Lieutenant Brennan's patient demonstrations and a young Mexican-American guard named Private Rodriguez, who spoke enough Spanish that some of the women, with Romance language education, could catch fragments of meaning. They would work in the camp, maintaining the facility, assisting with laundry, helping in the kitchen, light duties, nothing resembling forced labor. The women were assigned to different work details that afternoon. Greta found herself in the laundry with 5 other prisoners and an elderly guard named Chester who seemed more interested in whittling than supervising. He sat in the corner, creating small wooden animals with his pocket knife, occasionally looking up to nod approvingly at their work. Marguerite was sent to help in the administrative office, where she discovered that her careful handwriting and attention to detail were valued. The officer in charge, Captain William Hayes, actually thanked her when she organized a filing system. She nearly dropped the papers in shock. By the end of that first day, the women were exhausted not from physical labor, but from the mental strain of trying to reconcile everything they'd been taught with everything they were experiencing. Nothing made sense. Especially the way the guards treated them not as enemies, but simply as people. Corporal Jack Morrison had never intended to become a prison guard. He'd spent 38 years working cattle on his family's ranch outside Hereford, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. He understood livestock, weather patterns, and the hard economics of ranching. He knew nothing about war, military protocol, or how to supervise enemy prisoners. But when the Army requisitioned part of his land and called up local men to staff the new POW facility, Jack had little choice in the matter. The other guards were cut from similar cloth. Chester Williams had run sheep on the open range until arthritis slowed him down. Private Rodriguez had worked as a ranch hand since he was 12, breaking horses and mending fences. Even Lieutenant Brennan, though military trained, had grown up on a cattle operation in Montana. They were all children of the West, practical people shaped by landscapes that demanded cooperation and straightforwardness. The military had given them uniforms and basic training in prisoner management, but nothing could truly prepare ranchers to guard German women. The whole situation felt absurd to Jack. He'd expected hardened Nazi soldiers, men who would need watching every moment. Instead, he got 36 scared young women who looked at him like he might strike them at any second. His first instinct, the one bred into him by years of ranching, was to simply treat them like decent human beings. It wasn't softness or political ideology. It was just how he'd been raised. You treated people fairly, you kept your word, and you didn't abuse those weaker than yourself. The same principles that governed how he handled livestock applied to how he handled prisoners. That first morning, when Greta Fisher had flinched away from him during roll call, Jack had felt genuinely troubled. He'd taken off his hat, trying to appear less threatening, and had spoken in the gentlest tone he could manage. It hadn't occurred to him that this simple gesture would confuse her more than comfort her. Chester had laughed at him later in the guards' quarters. "You're treating them Nazi girls like spooked fillies, Jack." "They are spooked," Jack had replied, cleaning his boots. "Wouldn't you be? Captured in a foreign country? Don't speak the language? Don't know what's coming?" The other guards had their own approaches. Rodriguez tried to bridge the language gap, finding small ways to communicate through shared words and hand signals. Lieutenant Brennan maintained professional distance but insisted on respect and proper treatment. Captain Hayes, the camp commander, ran things by the book, but his book was written with West Texas common sense. None of them were warriors. They were working men and women doing an unexpected job in the middle of a global war. They brought to the task not military precision, but something perhaps more powerful, the uncomplicated decency of people who understood hardship and saw no point in creating more of it. This would prove to be exactly what the German women needed, though neither captors nor captives understood that yet. On the third day, Greta and 5 other women were assigned to kitchen duty. They followed Private Rodriguez through the mess hall and into a large, steaming kitchen where an enormous man in a white apron stood before a massive grill. His name was Samuel Big Sam Johnson, the camp cook, a former chuck wagon operator who'd fed cowboys on cattle drives before the war changed everything. Big Sam looked at the nervous German women and smiled, revealing a gap between his front teeth. "Well now," he said in a voice like rolling thunder, "looks like I got me some help today." He gestured toward a pile of potatoes. "Any of you ladies know how to peel?" Greta stepped forward hesitantly, recognizing the universal language of kitchen work. Sam handed her a peeler and pointed to a large pot. She began working, grateful for a task she understood. The other women quickly joined in, falling into the familiar rhythm of food preparation, but then Sam pulled out something that made them all stop and stare. From a large icebox, he retrieved what looked like an enormous amount of ground beef, fresh and red, more meat than Greta had seen in months. He dumped it into a huge metal bowl, added chopped onions, cracked several eggs into the mixture, and began working it with his massive hands. "Hamburger Day," he announced cheerfully to Private Rodriguez. "The boys love Hamburger Day." Greta watched, fascinated and disturbed. In Germany, meat was rationed so carefully that a family might get a small portion once a week if they were lucky. Here was enough beef to feed a village, being casually mixed in a bowl for a single meal. Sam formed the meat into patties, each one thick and generous, and lined them up on a tray. There must have been 60 or 70 of them. He caught Greta staring and chuckled. "First time seeing hamburgers made?" She nodded, not trusting her limited English. "Well, you're in for a treat then. Best thing we make here at Camp Hereford. Texas beef. Can't beat it." Margaretti, who'd been slicing tomatoes, whispered to Greta in German, "This can't be real. This much meat? For prisoners?" Sam noticed their whispered conversation and their shocked expressions. He didn't understand German, but he understood their faces. These women were starving back home while he was cooking with abundance they couldn't comprehend. For a moment, his cheerful demeanor faltered. He'd heard reports about conditions in Europe, about the rationing and shortages. Looking at their thin faces and worn clothes, he realized this meal wasn't just food to them, it was evidence. Evidence that everything they'd been told about American deprivation was a lie. Evidence that while their own country struggled with starvation, their enemy was feeding even prisoners with abundance. Sam placed the first batch of patties on the hot grill. The sizzle filled the kitchen, and the aroma of cooking beef made several women close their eyes, overwhelmed by hunger and confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope. The mess hall filled with the sounds of scraping chairs and quiet German conversations as the 37 women took their seats. American guards sat at separate tables, waiting for their own meals, but the usual distance between captor and captive felt different today. Big Sam and his kitchen crew, including Greta and the other German helpers, emerged carrying trays of hamburgers, each one still steaming from the grill. When Sam placed the first tray on the serving line, he called out in his booming voice, "Come on up, ladies. Don't be shy now." Lieutenant Brennan translated the invitation into her halting German, and slowly, the women formed a line. Each received a hamburger, a serving of potato salad, pickles, and a cup of cold lemonade. The portions were identical to what the guards would receive, nothing marked them as lesser or as enemy. Greta carried her tray back to the table where Margarete and 3 others sat. They all stared at their meals in unified silence. The hamburger was enormous, the bun soft and fresh, the beef patty thick enough that juice from it had begun to soak into the bread. The smell was intoxicating, but none of them moved to eat. "It could be poisoned," whispered Elsa Meyer, a former radio operator from Munich. "Or drugged." Margarete shook her head slowly. "Why would they poison us? We're already captured, and the guards are eating the same food." Indeed, across the room, Corporal Morrison had bitten into his hamburger with evident pleasure, tomato seeds squirting onto his plate. Greta picked up her hamburger with both hands, feeling the warmth of it, the weight of it. She thought about the potatoes she'd peeled earlier, how fresh they'd been. She thought about Big Sam's gap-toothed smile, so genuine it seemed impossible to fake. She thought about home, about her mother's thin soup made from scraps, about her younger sister's hollow cheeks. And then she took a bite. The taste exploded across her tongue. Rich, savory beef seasoned with salt and pepper, the sweetness of the tomato, the crisp freshness of lettuce, the creamy sharpness of that strange orange cheese Sam had called American. She chewed slowly, and despite every attempt to maintain her composure, a small sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a sigh. Around the table, the other women began to eat. Some cried openly. Others ate in stunned silence, their hands shaking slightly. These weren't tears of sadness, but of complete cognitive dissonance. Every bite contradicted years of propaganda. Every swallow forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. If they'd been lied to about American cruelty and deprivation, what else had been a lie? Across the mess hall, Corporal Morrison watched the German women eat. He saw their tears, their shock, their confusion. He didn't fully understand what was happening in their hearts and minds, but he knew, somehow, that this meal mattered more than any speech or policy document ever could. Sometimes, kindness was just a hamburger, served hot and without conditions. That night, Greta lay on her cot, unable to sleep, her stomach full for the first time in months, her mind racing with memories she'd tried to suppress. She thought about the winter of 1943, when her family's ration cards had barely kept them alive. Her mother had given her own portions to Greta's younger siblings, claiming she wasn't hungry while her cheekbones grew sharper each week. The Reich Labor Service had promised better food, a chance to serve and be provided for, and it had been better, marginally. Thin stews with occasional bits of meat, bread that was more sawdust than flour, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. They'd been told this was necessary sacrifice, that German strength came from their ability to endure hardship while the enemy wallowed in stolen luxury. But today she'd eaten a hamburger made from fresh beef, served by her captors as if it were nothing special. Just Tuesday's lunch. Margaret's voice came through the darkness from the next cot. "Are you awake?" "Yes," Greta whispered back. "I keep thinking about my brother Klaus. He's 14 now, if he's still alive. I wonder when he last had real meat." Other voices joined them in the dark barracks, women unable to sleep, all wrestling with the same painful realizations. Elsa spoke softly. "My mother wrote to me last year, before I was captured. She said the ration had been cut again. She was making soup from potato peels and calling it dinner. I saw children in Berlin begging for scraps," added another voice, belonging to Anna Schmidt. "Their mothers stood in line for hours for a single loaf of bread. And here, they story, gave us hamburgers. To prisoners. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding they wished they didn't have. They'd been taught that America was weak, decadent, running out of resources because of their wasteful ways. They'd been told that Germany's suffering was noble, temporary, that victory would bring abundance. Instead, the defeated were eating better than the victorious. The captured were fed better than the free. Greta thought about the propaganda films they'd been shown, images of American cities in chaos, of breadlines and poverty. She thought about the promises that German sacrifice would lead to prosperity, that their enemies were on the verge of collapse. "They lied to us," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "About everything." No one contradicted her. They couldn't. The evidence sat in their stomachs, undeniable and damning. These women had believed they were serving a righteous cause, defending their homeland from barbaric enemies. They'd been proud of their service, convinced of their moral superiority even in defeat. One hamburger hadn't just fed them. It had shattered the foundations of everything they'd been taught to believe. And lying in the darkness of their Texas barracks, full and warm and safe, they began to understand that being captured might have saved them from more than just the war. It might have saved them from drowning in lies they would have died defending. Corporal Jack Morrison noticed the change in the German women after Hamburger Day. They moved differently, spoke more quietly among themselves, looked at their guards with new uncertainty in their eyes. He recognized that look from working with animals. It was the expression of a creature realizing its assumptions about the world might be wrong. 3 days after that first hamburger meal, Jack found Greta sitting alone outside the barracks during afternoon break, staring at the horizon where cattle grazed against an endless sky. He approached slowly, hat in hand, and gestured to ask if he could sit on the nearby bench. She nodded, wary, but not afraid. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Jack pulled out a piece of jerky from his pocket and offered her half. She took it hesitantly, examining the dried meat before taking a small bite. "Beef jerky," Jack said slowly, pointing to the cattle in the distance, then to the jerky. "From cow. We make it on ranch. Last long time." Greta's English was improving daily, and she managed, "This is, how you say, normal? For you?" Jack nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Texas raises cattle. Lots of cattle. Been doing it since my granddaddy's time. We got more beef than we know what to do with sometimes." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "In Germany, meat is..." She struggled for the word, then simply held up her fingers to indicate something very small. "Little, very little." Jack felt a tightness in his chest. He'd heard about rationing in Europe, but hearing it from someone who'd lived it made it real. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "That must have been hard." Greta's eyes widened slightly at the apology. "You are sorry? But we are enemy." "Well," Jack said, settling his hat back on his head, "I reckon the way I see it, you're just a person who got caught up in something bigger than yourself. Same as me, really. I didn't choose this war. I'm guessing you didn't either." She was quiet for a moment, then asked in careful English, "Why you are kind to us? We are Nazi." Jack considered this. "My daddy taught me something when I was young. He said you judge a man not by what he says he believes, but by how he treats folks when nobody's watching. Far as I can tell, you ladies haven't done nothing to deserve cruelty. You work hard, you follow the rules, you're respectful." He paused. "Besides, being kind don't cost me nothing, and maybe it makes this whole ugly situation a little more bearable for everybody." Greta looked down at the jerky in her hand, this casual gift that represented more abundance than she'd known in years. "In Germany, they tell us, Americans are cruel, bad people." Jack smiled sadly. "Well, I reckon they told you lots of things that weren't true." She nodded slowly, and in that moment, another wall crumbled. Not with drama or fanfare, but with the quiet kindness of a cowboy sharing his jerky on a Texas afternoon. Within 2 weeks, kitchen duty had become the most requested work assignment among the German women. Big Sam's domain offered warmth, purpose, and something unexpected: joy. The massive cook had a gift for making work feel like collaboration rather than captivity, and he'd taken particular interest in teaching the women about American cooking. Greta had become his unofficial assistant, her careful attention to detail and growing English making her invaluable. One afternoon, Sam decided to teach her the art of making proper Texas chili, a dish that required patience and intuition more than precise measurement. "Now, the secret," Sam explained, stirring an enormous pot, "is you gotta let the flavors get to know each other. Can't rush it." He added cumin, chili powder, and a dash of something he called his secret ingredient. "You just throw it in?" "Can't rush it?" Greta asked, amazed at his casual approach. "No measuring?" Sam laughed, his belly shaking. "Cooking ain't like following orders, Miss Greta. It's more like having a conversation. You taste, you adjust, you listen to what the food is telling you." The concept was entirely foreign to her. In Germany, everything had been about precision, rules, following instructions exactly. Sam's kitchen operated on instinct and generosity. That same afternoon, Marguerite shyly asked if she could share a recipe from home. Through halting English and hand gestures, she explained how to make Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes her grandmother had taught her to make. Sam listened with genuine interest, then pulled out potatoes, eggs, and flour. "Well, let's make them then. Show us how." "It's done." Working together, the German women and American cook created something neither had tasted before. Kartoffelpuffer made with abundant ingredients, not the meager wartime substitutes. When Sam tried one, his face lit up. "That's delicious. We ought to serve these for breakfast sometime." The idea that their food, their culture, could be valued rather than dismissed brought tears to Marguerite's eyes. Soon, the kitchen became a place of cultural exchange. Anna Schmidt taught Sam how to make spätzle. Elsa Meyer shared her mother's recipe for apple strudel, which Sam adapted using Texas pecans instead of scarce walnuts. In return, Sam taught them about barbecue, cornbread, and the fine art of making biscuits so light they practically floated. But more than recipes were being exchanged. As they cooked side by side, conversations deepened. Sam talked about his family, his 3 sons serving overseas, his worry for them. The women shared carefully edited stories of home, avoiding the painful parts, but revealing glimpses of their humanity. Private Rodriguez often joined them, translating when needed, adding his own family's Mexican recipes to the mix. The kitchen became a place where the war felt distant, where former enemies discovered they shared the universal language of food and family. One evening, as Greta helped Sam clean the massive grill, he said quietly, "You know, Miss Greta, I think food might be the best diplomacy there is. Hard to hate someone after you've broken bread with them." She nodded, understanding that in this kitchen, they weren't building just meals, they were building bridges. The International Red Cross had established mail service for prisoners of war, and by October, the women at Camp Hereford were finally able to send and receive letters from Germany. The arrival of the first mail call created a mixture of hope and dread that rippled through the barracks. Greta received a letter from her mother, the thin paper covered in cramped handwriting. She sat on her cot, hands trembling as she read about her family's survival. Her younger siblings were alive but hungry. Her father had been wounded on the Eastern Front and sent home. The apartment building they'd lived in had been destroyed in a bombing raid, and they were now sharing 2 rooms with another family. Her mother's words were careful, aware that censors would read them, but between the lines, Greta could read the desperation. "We are managing as best we can. The rations were reduced again. Your sister asks about you daily. We pray for your safe return." Greta stared at the letter, then at the plate of cookies Big Sam had sent back with the kitchen crew that afternoon. Oatmeal cookies with real sugar and raisins, given freely as a snack. She picked up her pen to write back and found herself paralyzed. What could she possibly say? If she told the truth, that she was eating well, sleeping in a warm bed, being treated with kindness, would her family think she'd betrayed Germany? Would they believe she'd been seduced by enemy propaganda? But if she lied and claimed harsh treatment, wouldn't that make her complicit in the same deceptions that had brought them all to this point? Around the barracks, other women wrestled with identical dilemmas. Margarete had received word that her fiancé was missing, presumed dead after the Soviet advance. She sat crying quietly while Anna tried to comfort her. Elsa had gotten no letter at all, and the silence was perhaps worse than bad news. Lieutenant Brennan noticed the somber mood during evening inspection. She'd been briefed to expect this, the moment when prisoners confronted the reality of their severed connections to home. but she was surprised when Greta approached her after lights out, asking to speak privately. In the small office, Greta struggled to find words in English. "Lieutenant, I must write to my mother, but I do not know what to say. If I tell truth about here, she will not believe. If I lie, I am like them, the ones who lied to us." Brennan sat back in her chair considering. "What does your heart tell you to write? That I am safe, that I am treated well, that I am confused about everything I thought I knew." Greta's voice broke slightly. "That I am ashamed I have food while she is hungry." "Then write that," Brennan said gently. "Write the truth. Maybe that's the most important thing you can do right now. Tell the truth, even when it's hard." That night, by candlelight, 37 women wrote letters home. Some told careful truths, others told comforting lies, but all of them felt the weight of the gap between their reality and their family's suffering. November brought cooler weather to the Texas Panhandle, and with it, an announcement that surprised everyone. Captain Hayes had authorized a Thanksgiving celebration, and Big Sam proposed something unprecedented. An outdoor cookout where guards and prisoners would eat together, no separate tables, no divisions, just a shared meal under the open sky. The women had heard about Thanksgiving from their English lessons, this peculiar American holiday centered on gratitude and abundance. The irony wasn't lost on them. They were prisoners being invited to celebrate plenty while their families starved across the ocean. Yet something about the invitation felt significant, as if crossing this small social boundary might mean more than any of them fully understood. The day arrived cold and clear, the sky that brilliant blue unique to Texas autumn. Big Sam had been cooking since before dawn, preparing what he called a proper Thanksgiving spread. 2 massive turkeys roasted over open pits, their skin crackling and golden. Dutch ovens buried in coals held sweet potatoes, cornbread dressing, and green beans cooked with bacon. The aroma carried across the camp, making everyone's mouth water. Long tables had been set up outside, covered with simple cloth. There were no assigned seats, no guard section or prisoners area, just places to sit. Greta watched as Corporal Morrison carried platters of turkey to the tables, his movements casual and unhurried. Private Rodriguez brought out bowls of mashed potatoes, steam rising into the cool air. Even Lieutenant Brennan and Captain Hayes worked alongside everyone else, serving food instead of being served. When Big Sam rang the dinner bell, there was a moment of hesitation. The old patterns were strong. Prisoners didn't eat with their captors as equals. But then Anna Schmidt, emboldened by months of kitchen work, walked to the table and sat down next to Chester, the elderly guard. She smiled at him nervously. He smiled back and offered her the first serving of turkey. The spell was broken. Women and guards filled the tables in mixed groups, sitting where they pleased, passing dishes back and forth without thinking about who was enemy and who was ally. The conversation started hesitantly, bridged by Private Rodriguez's translations and the women's improving English, but soon the tables filled with the sounds of laughter and genuine exchange. Corporal Morrison found himself sitting across from Greta. He carved her a generous slice of turkey breast and explained the tradition of Thanksgiving, about pilgrims and Native Americans, about gratitude in hard times. She listened carefully, then said in her accented English, "This is like what we call Erntedankfest, Harvest Festival. We give thanks for food too. See," Jack said, his weathered face creasing into a smile, "we're not so different after all." As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, Greta looked around at the tables. At German women and American cowboys sharing jokes and passing gravy. At former enemies discovering they could sit together without hatred. At a moment that felt less like captivity and more like community. She thought about writing this to her mother and knew she would struggle to find words that could capture the impossible beauty of it. A week after Thanksgiving, Corporal Morrison made an unusual proposal to Captain Hayes. Several of the German women had expressed curiosity about where all the food came from, particularly the seemingly endless supply of beef. Jack suggested a supervised visit to his family's ranch, a chance for the prisoners to understand the reality of American agriculture. Hayes was skeptical at first, but Lieutenant Brennan argued it might be educational, a way to combat the propaganda the women had been fed. On a crisp Saturday morning, Greta, Margareta, Anna, Elsa, and 4 other women, climbed into the back of a military truck with Morrison and Rodriguez as escorts. The drive to the Morrison ranch took 20 minutes, winding through landscape that still amazed them with its vastness. Jack's father, Thomas Morrison, waited at the ranch house, a lean man in his 60s with the same kind eyes as his son. He greeted the women with respectful nods, showing none of the hostility they might have expected. His wife, Mary, had prepared lemonade and cookies, treating enemy prisoners like welcomed guests. Thomas took them on a walking tour of the operation. They saw thousands of cattle grazing across rolling pasture land that stretched to the horizon. He explained how ranching worked, how the animals were bred, raised, and eventually brought to market. The scale was incomprehensible to the women. "How many cows?" Greta asked in careful English. "On this ranch? About 3,000 head," Thomas replied. "And we're mid-sized for this area. The bigger ranches run 10,000 or more." Marguerite's face showed her mental calculations. 3,000 cattle on one ranch among hundreds in Texas alone. She thought about Germany's desperate rationing, about families fighting over scraps of meat, about the propaganda that claimed America was starving. The mathematics of it was devastating. Thomas seemed to understand their shock. He spoke slowly, making sure Rodriguez could translate anything they missed. "Before the war, we used to export beef all over the world. Now, most of it goes to feeding our troops and our allies. But we got plenty. The land here is good for cattle, always has been." He showed them the feed operations, the breeding programs, the veterinary care the animals received. Every detail reinforced the same impossible truth. America had so much abundance that even its animals ate better than German civilians. Mary Morrison invited them into the ranch house for lunch, and the women found themselves sitting in a real home for the first time since capture. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of pot roast. Photographs on the walls showed 3 generations of Morrisons working this land. Mary served them generous portions, her movements practiced and easy. "Our youngest son is somewhere in France right now," she said quietly, looking at the women. "Fighting in your homeland. I pray every night he comes home safe." The words hung in the air. These women might have encountered Mary's son on a battlefield. Their countrymen might have killed him. Yet here she was, feeding them from her table, offering them kindness without conditions. Greta felt something shift inside her, a final wall crumbling under the weight of grace she didn't deserve. The idea came to Margarete during a December evening in the barracks. The women had been discussing their futures with growing anxiety as rumors of war's end circulated. What would happen to them? Where would they go? Who would they become after everything they'd learned? "We should write it down," Margarete said suddenly. "Write what down?" Anna asked. "Everything. The recipes, both American and German. The things we've learned here. A book that shows what happened to us." The idea caught fire among the women. It would be a record of their transformation, proof that enemies could learn from each other, and a gift they could leave behind when they eventually departed. Lieutenant Brennan, when approached about the project, surprised them by enthusiastically approving it and even securing paper and pencils through official channels. The recipe book became a collective effort. Greta wrote down Big Sam's hamburger recipe with precise detail, noting his advice to let the meat rest and never press down on the patty while cooking. Anna documented the proper technique for Texas chili, including Sam's secret ingredient, a small amount of dark chocolate that added depth to the flavor. In turn, the women contributed their own family recipes: Margarete's Kartoffelpuffer, Elsa's Sauerbraten, Anna's Black Forest cake, though she noted sadly that the version they'd made at camp used ingredients they'd never had access to in wartime Germany. Each recipe came with small stories, memories of grandmother's kitchens, of Sunday dinners before the war, of traditions they hoped might survive. But they also included American recipes they'd learned: Big Sam's cornbread, Mary Morrison's pot roast, the Thanksgiving turkey preparation, biscuits and gravy that had become a camp favorite. Private Rodriguez contributed his mother's tamale recipe, expanding their collection beyond just German and American traditions. As they worked on the book, something remarkable happened. They began adding personal notes between the recipes. Greta wrote about her first hamburger, the shock and confusion it had caused. Anna included a reflection on how food had become their bridge across enemy lines. Margarete penned a short essay about what it meant to break bread with those you'd been taught to hate. Big Sam, when he learned about the project, insisted on writing the foreword. In his simple, direct style, he wrote about how cooking had taught him that people everywhere shared the same basic needs and desires. "We all got to eat," he wrote. "Might as well do it together and make it taste good." The recipe book grew to over 50 pages, handwritten and illustrated with simple drawings. The women debated what to call it. Finally, Greta suggested a title that everyone agreed captured their journey. From enemy tables to common ground, recipes of reconciliation. It wasn't just a cookbook. It was their testimony, their confession, and their hope that what had happened in this small Texas camp might matter beyond its wire fences. It was their way of saying that they'd been changed, and that the change was real, and that it had started with something as simple as a hamburger served with unexpected kindness. May 8, 1945. The announcement came over the camp's radio in the middle of the afternoon. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Lieutenant Brennan gathered the women in the mess hall to share the news officially, her voice steady but her eyes revealing the complexity of the moment. For the American staff, it meant victory, relief, the hope that loved ones would soon return home. For the German women, it meant something far more complicated. Greta sat motionless as Brennan explained that arrangements for repatriation would begin soon. They would be returned to Germany, to a defeated homeland, to families and cities that might no longer exist. The room was silent except for the sound of someone crying softly in the back row. There was no celebration, no relief, only a hollow uncertainty that seemed to fill the space like cold water. That evening, the women gathered in their barracks, speaking in hushed German for the first time in weeks. It felt strange to retreat to their native language, as if they'd grown accustomed to the broken English that had become their bridge to this new world. "What is there to return to?" Elsa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My city was bombed to rubble. My family, I don't even know if they survived." "At least it's home," Marguerite said, but her words lacked conviction. "Is it?" Anna challenged. "Is a place still home when everything you believed about it was a lie?" The question hung in the air like smoke. These women had spent 6 months learning that their country had committed atrocities they couldn't have imagined, had lied about everything from food supplies to the nature of their enemies, had sacrificed its people for a cause that was not just defeated but morally bankrupt. Greta thought about her family's letter, about her mother's hunger, her father's wounds, her siblings' uncertain futures. She wanted to see them desperately, but she also knew that returning meant confronting not just physical devastation, but the complete collapse of everything she'd believed about who she was and what she'd been serving. "Here, we learn to be different people," she said slowly. "Better people, maybe. What happens to us when we go back to a place that made us who we were before?" The women understood what she meant. At Camp Hereford, they'd been given permission to question, to learn, to transform. They'd been treated with dignity that allowed them to see their own humanity clearly, perhaps for the first time. Returning to Germany meant returning to judgment, shame, and the overwhelming task of rebuilding from ruins both physical and moral. Over the next few days, the camp took on a strange atmosphere. The work continued, the meals were shared, the routines maintained, but everyone moved through them with a sense of ending. Corporal Morrison seemed quieter, his usual easy manner replaced with something like sadness. Big Sam cooked with less energy, his kitchen feeling more subdued. Even the Texas sky seemed less bright, as if the landscape itself understood that something precious was about to be lost. 2 weeks after the surrender announcement, Captain Hayes called a meeting with his staff to discuss the repatriation procedures. What he didn't expect was for Corporal Morrison to speak up with an unprecedented request. "Sir, some of us have been talking, and well, we'd like to explore whether any of these women could stay." Hayes looked up sharply from his paperwork. "Stay? Morrison, they're enemy prisoners of war. The regulations are clear. I understand that, sir, but hear me out." Jack shifted his weight, uncomfortable with contradicting his commander, but compelled to speak. "These women aren't Nazis. Most of them didn't even understand what they were part of. They've worked hard, learned English, shown real character. And honestly, sir, most of them don't have much to go back to." Lieutenant Brennan added her voice. The captain should know that several local families have approached me about sponsorship possibilities. The Hendersons, the Morgans, even Reverend Sullivan from the Baptist Church. They've gotten to know these women through the outreach programs. Hayes leaned back in his chair, troubled. This isn't a simple matter. The War Department has protocols. These women are supposed to return to occupied Germany for processing. But sir, Private Rodriguez interjected, what if they don't want to go? What if they request asylum or displaced person status? The question opened a door no one had quite dared to approach. Could prisoners of war choose not to be repatriated? The legal ground was murky, unprecedented. That evening, Hayes took an unusual step. He invited several of the German women to his office for a frank conversation. Greta, Margarete, Anna, and Elsa sat nervously before him as he spoke through Lieutenant Brennan's translation. I need to know something, and I need honest answers. If you had a choice, what would you want to do when this camp closes? The women exchanged glances, each afraid to speak first. Finally, Greta found her courage. Captain Hayes, I want to see my family. I miss them terribly, but I am afraid of what I will become if I return to Germany. Here, I have learned to think differently, to be different. I am afraid that returning will erase all of that. Anna spoke next, her English now confident enough to need no translation. My family is dead, all of them. I have nothing to return to except ruins and shame. Here, I have found purpose. Doctor, Hayes at the hospital says I could continue training as a nurse. Why would I choose nothing over something? Margarete's voice was soft but clear. We are not the same women who arrived here. Germany made us one way. America has shown us we could be another way. Is it wrong to want to choose the better way? Hayes sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. I'll make some inquiries with the War Department. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. After they left, he sat alone in his office, wondering when enemy prisoners had become people he wanted to help rather than simply process according to regulations. July 1945. The camp at Hereford was preparing to close. Most of the German women had been processed for repatriation, boarding trains that would take them to ports and ships bound for Europe. But 9 women remained, their futures hanging in an unprecedented bureaucratic limbo that Captain Hayes had managed to navigate through sheer determination and a web of official channels. The War Department had agreed to reclassify them as displaced persons, allowing them to apply for immigration status if they could secure American sponsors. The response from the Hereford community had been overwhelming. Greta stood in the now empty mess hall, holding her copy of the recipe book they'd created. The Hendersons had offered her a place to live and a job teaching German at the local high school. She'd accepted, knowing it meant years before she might see her family again, knowing they might never forgive her choice. But she also knew she couldn't return to being who she was before. Anna had been accepted into a nursing program in Amarillo, sponsored by Dr. Hayes and his wife. Marguerite would work at the Morrison Ranch, helping Mary with bookkeeping and gradually learning the cattle business. The others had found similar paths, each one supported by families who'd seen their transformation and believed in their potential. Corporal Morrison found Greta in the mess hall on that last day. "You going to be all right, Miss Greta?" She smiled, though her eyes were wet with tears. "I think so, Corporal Morrison. Thank you. For the hamburger. For everything." He laughed softly. "Never thought a hamburger could change someone's life." "It was not just the hamburger," she said carefully. "It was what the hamburger meant. That you saw us as people worth feeding, worth treating well. That changed everything." Big Sam emerged from the kitchen with one final gift. Fresh hamburgers for everyone. One last meal together before the camp closed forever. The remaining women, the guards, and several local families who'd come to say goodbye gathered around the tables. As they ate, Greta thought about that first hamburger 6 months ago, how shocking it had been, how it had shattered every lie she'd believed. She thought about her journey from enemy prisoner to something she was still learning to name. Not quite American, not quite German anymore. Something new, forged in the unexpected kindness of Texas cowboys and the simple dignity of shared meals. 20 years later, Greta Henderson would stand before a university audience, a professor of languages and a naturalized American citizen, telling this story. She'd bring the original recipe book, now carefully preserved, and explain how food had become the bridge that helped former enemies discover their common humanity. Anna Weber became head nurse at Amarillo General, known for her compassion and her insistence on treating every patient with dignity. Marguerite Morrison eventually inherited part of the ranch, the first woman in the county to run a major cattle operation. They never forgot where they came from or what they'd escaped, but they also never forgot the taste of that first hamburger, the moment when everything changed, when cowboys served them grace on a bun and invited them to become something better than they'd ever imagined possible.